This is part 6, and for now, probably the final part of the story about my great grandmother, Ella Perry, who was committed to Huntington State Hospital in West Virginia for 36 years. I should say final part unless I find new information in my ongoing family history research. I really didn't expect this story to get a lot of views. Part 1 got over 1 million, and I also wasn't prepared for how weird I'd feel about it. This page was supposed to be fairly anonymous, a lifestyle page about my she shed, and it still is. But while I've wanted to tell Ella's story for years, I didn't expect to feel so exposed. But I'm back to finish up with a chapter that I think is important to tell. There's probably more I could say about the hospital itself, but honestly, that hospital has the same story as state hospitals throughout our country during that era. I do plan to keep sharing compelling stories, maybe weekly, and they'll be more like this one, but maybe not so personal to me. I hope you'll stay for those stories and for my She Shed content. Okay, let's get to part 6. My great uncle Mason Perry was killed in action during World War II. He was 26 years old. He was my grandma's younger brother, born in Logan County, West Virginia in 1918. His draft card describes him as 5'1", 135 pounds, blue eyes, blonde hair. I can't get past the fact that he was only 5'1". I'm only 5'2" and more than 135. So I can't imagine him going through what he did at his size. Before the Army, Mason worked at the West Virginia Industrial School for Boys in Prunytown, an institution with a dark history of its own, rivaling that of Huntington State Hospital. That could be a story on its own. That could be a story. Anyway, on his draft card, Mason listed his oldest sister, Laura, as the person who would always know where he was. You might recall that the two youngest boys, under 5, were raised by Laura and her husband. Sounds like she basically became the de facto parent, even though Warren was still alive. She was born in 1906, the oldest child of Ella and Warren, and so she was 12 years older than Mason and 22 years older than the youngest boy. By the time Mason went to war, he was married and had an infant son named George. George would later be diagnosed with muscular dystrophy, but I think that was after Mason died. He would have been 3 when Mason died. Mason served in the infantry in northern Italy. By September of 1944, the war had already been raging for years. Rome had fallen, Paris had been liberated, the Allies were moving closer to Germany, and for the first time, the end of the war was beginning to feel imaginable. But the fighting in Italy wasn't over. The Germans had retreated into the northern Apennine Mountains and built one final major defensive barrier called the Gothic Line. The Allied assault on that line was known as Operation Olive. Soldiers had to climb steep mountains carrying weapons, ammunition, and heavy packs while German troops fired down from fortified positions above them. And that's where I picture Mason, 5'1" and 135 pounds. A young husband and father from Man, West Virginia, climbing an Italian mountain very much like the ones back home. At his size, I can't help but think of him as a real-life Steve Rogers. Captain America before they gave him a special serum. Mason's military hospital record is painfully brief. It identifies him as an enlisted infantryman. It says he became a battle casualty in September of 1944 and was wounded by a bullet or another type of projectile while serving in the line of duty. His discharge status simply says died. Other military records gave his date of death as September 14, 1944. The Gothic Line would be breached soon afterward. Germany would surrender less than 8 months later. He'd made it through so much of the war. His family was back home waiting for him. And then, so close to the end, he was gone. I did look into it. They didn't actually return the bodies right away. They interred them in temporary cemeteries over there. And then starting in 1947 through 1951, gave families the option of having them brought back home. Some are still in American military cemeteries in Europe. But Mason did come home. He was laid to rest in the Perry Cemetery in Earling, West Virginia. And in 1948, Warren Perry died and was also buried in Earling. I don't know who was buried first because I don't know when Mason was brought back, but they are side by side in the Perry Cemetery. Ella lived until 1966, but she wasn't buried beside them. She was buried in a different cemetery altogether in Chapmanville, also in Logan County. Not at the hospital, but for some reason not with them. There's another reason Mason's story became so personal for me. My dad's middle name was Mason. And years later, I named my own son Mason without knowing the full significance of that name in our family. I just liked the name, and I liked that I could honor my dad by naming my son after him. It was only when I began my deep dive into our family history that I found my great uncle Mason and understood who he had been, and I felt an immediate connection to him. When I picture this 5'1", 26-year-old young father climbing those mountains, I can't help imagining my own son. Really, it just really breaks my heart. Mason wasn't just an entry in my family tree with dates and facts. He was Ella's baby and my grandma's little brother, husband, father of a baby who would grow up disabled without him. Dad carried his name, my son carries his name, and I do think of him often, just like I do Ella. I feel a special connection to both of them, and it's a privilege to honor them by keeping their stories alive. Stay tuned for future standalone stories from the She Shed. I promise they'll be just as riveting as that one.